Hi, everyone. Okay, so we're going to continue the lecture where we kind of left off, but I'll give you like a really quick review. But just to remind you, we're talking about relationships in the digital age and how people form relationships, mostly in like online settings. And we talked about how people are social and they're always looking for other people and they can't tell the difference between media and real life, even though they kind of can, but they kind of can't. And oh, by the way, we use tech to develop relationships, sometimes solely online, but most of them are offline. And people have this weird thing about dating websites and they think it's icky and people are going to deceive people on it. And it reflects poorly on the person who has to go online to meet somebody, but it really doesn't. That's just like a stigma. And even though deception is a thing, usually people deceive each other online for non-malicious reasons. Um, and it's kind of like normal. But, this is where we left out. Catfishing is a thing. So catfishing, as most of you probably know, thanks to the MTV show and the documentary before that, is it refers to when somebody pretends to be somebody who they're not, using some sort of social media identity. And I know, like, the Urban Dictionary says Facebook, but it could be any social media identity to create a false identity, particularly to pursue deceptive online romances, right? The whole point is being deceptive, if you will. How common is catfishing? We don't know. We really don't. The problem, though, remember we talked about when we did the news unit about exemplification effects. Remember I used the example of like Jaws or like or a news article about a shark attack. Like once you see an example of something, an exemplar, you're more likely to estimate its likelihood of occurring. So I do think that part of the problem with catfish is that because people talk about it, because it is so extreme, it sticks in your memory, and it's a very vivid, it's a very vivid memory, if you will, about the types of bad things that can happen online. So people probably overestimate how much it does happen. That said, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. And another thing that is interesting about the catfish phenomenon that I hear a lot of people talk about is not just like, oh, how could somebody be so deceptive, right? But also, how could people fall for it? How could somebody fall in love with somebody who they've never even met before, especially given, the likelihood of being deceived online? And so that's kind of like gonna bring us into a larger conversation about why. Perhaps contrary to what you may have believed, there are some cases that when people develop relationships online, they can actually fall more in love than they would if they were face to face. But I'm going to get there in a second. Um, First, I just want to talk about when people first started to study relationship development. When I say study, I mean like researchers professors at universities. When people first started trying to figure out like what are people doing on this internet thing, like let's say back in the 80s, like before, like before even I was on the internet, to be fair. Um, a lot of the research just sort of assumed that um, if people are trying to develop a relationship online, it's always inferior to what could happen in face to face. It kind of puts like face to face communication as the gold standard of communication. And they said the less nonverbal cues we have, the less likely it is that you're going to have a satisfying communication interaction. So that means that anything with more nonverbal cues. So that's what we mean when we say cues, nonverbal cues. So like if I was talking to you on a speakerphone in a meeting, that would not be as good as if I was in the meeting itself, where you could actually see me, because I have more nonverbal cues. If I was trying to text with you, that would not be as good as if I texted with you with with pictures of myself or something. Like the more nonverbal communication, like with my hands or my voice or my eyes, the more I can infuse the interaction with information about how I'm feeling or what I mean. Like it makes it, quote, easier to communicate. So because of that, this cues filtered out perspective on relationships and technology. And it really wasn't all just about romantic relationships. Some of it, I mentioned like the speakerphone in a boardroom, like it was organizational communication, like trying to study, like, is it better for people to get work done if they're online or not? And most of the assumptions was just that face-to-face is better. It's richer. So when we talk about media richness, more cues is better for communication. It's better for relationship development. Less cues, right? The less that you can see or feel of somebody, things that are just only text where you don't get a lot of information, should be not as good. However, and for the record, I should actually, before I say this, let me just say that is not untrue. In many cases, that is correct, that it is easier, for instance, to get work done with somebody or you could get it done maybe faster if you're able to talk to them. I mean, this is why, by the way, I really appreciate in asynchronous classes where we don't ever really get to talk one-on-one. If somebody wants if somebody wants some help, it's way easier for me to just talk to you than it is for me to type an email, because I know I can just express myself more and I can see your feedback and whatever. Cues filtered out is a problem for that type of communication. Okay, but that said, in the 1990s, this guy, Joe Walther, that's kind of what he looks like. Although funny enough, he's this guy up here with the beard, he's lost a lot of weight, so he would not have as much of a circular thing. But anyway, he questioned some of these assumptions, though, and it doesn't mean that those assumptions were wrong, but he wanted to complicate it a little bit. And he was like, well, okay, yeah, it's true that text-based communication, for instance, might not be as good as face-to-face communication if you have a limited amount of time. But if you have more time to get to know somebody in a text-based format, couldn't you also have a rewarding interaction with them? And he did a test where he actually sort of randomly assigned people to either try to get to know each other, like just two strangers, like, hey, try to get to know each other, sit in this room, tell yourselves about each other, or I want you to go into two separate rooms and text to each other about yourselves. And basically, he found that, yes, indeed, the people who got to communicate face-to-face got to know each other better. But there's a catch. He did it again, and he gave the people who were texting more time. And once they had more time, the results were equal in both groups, meaning that the people who were only allowed to get to know each other by text messaging, this is my text messaging, were able to develop as good a first impression and relationship as the people who were allowed to communicate face-to-face. So this is the thing. It takes longer, but relationship effects, it takes longer, but relationship effects are essentially the same given time, okay? So people are still able to sort of get around the fact that they don't have nonverbal cues. Social information processing theory is like, right, that's why we have like emojis. That's why people started doing the smiley face with the colon and the parentheses close, right? Because what happens is we actually infuse our communication with additional cues to sort of compensate for their lack. And we can still get a lot done even if we're communicating online. So that's what social information processing theory says. One easy way to remember this is, so social information processing, sipping versus gulping. So SIP, S-I-P, if you're online, you're just taking in little bits of information. Like you can't see the whole picture. But if you're face-to-face with somebody, you get a lot of information. So it's like guzzling, it's like gulping it, right? So both can be productive, but if you're sipping, it's going to take a lot longer. Okay. But okay, back to the catfishing example. Then Joe Walther was also like, well, okay, so great. This is cool that I found that in some cases, we can have just as good of communication, even when we're, in reduced cues, like primarily texting based environments. Okay. But how do you explain those people who are getting catfished? Where like, you know, they don't just have like good interactions, they actually fall in love with people who they've never even met face to face before. How on earth? And sometimes it happens quickly, right? Like sometimes, have you ever had like a friend who just like sort of seems like really into somebody and it's like, okay, pump the brakes a little bit, like maybe just wait until like, I don't know, you just make sure that they don't have body odors or something, whatever. How is it that in some cases people develop these rapid relationships online without any face-to-face communication? This is like a famous comic, like nobody on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, implying dogs are deceiving people. And then this is whatever, don't worry about it. Okay, so Joe Walther, after he did social information processing theory, he started doing more research, and he also developed what's called the hyperpersonal model or hyperpersonal communication theory. And what this argues is that in some cases, actually, on communication in reduced Q environments where we don't have a lot of nonverbals, so messaging systems and texts and dating sites and all this stuff, is actually better for relationship development. And the reason is because of things that we've already talked about before. When you're in those environments, think about all the advantages. First of all, people can selectively choose what information to present and not. You can't do that face to face. When you're at the bar, like you've just got what you got. You know what I mean? But here, like you don't even know like if I'm wearing like, shorts right now, or if I'm wearing pajama pants, or if I'm wearing a ball gown. Like you can't really, I can selectively show you different parts of myself, different parts of my outfit, all sorts of things. I can put on filters, I can do all sorts of things. I'm wearing pajama pants, by the way. I just put on a lot of like jewelry to make it seem like I got dressed, but nope. So there are the Cinder has a lot of control. The other thing is like, we also, even if we, like, for instance, even if I hadn't told you that I was wearing pajama pants, you probably would have filled in the blanks and assumed that I was wearing like jeans or something normal and professional, right? The receiver also, when they don't have all of the information from all of the nonverbal cues, will kind of fill things in. And, in another, lecture last week, we talked about halo effects, like how when people already believe something positive about somebody, they're going to tend to believe other positive things. So if you already think that like, oh, right, Dr. Cohen looks very like put together. I'm not saying I do, but I'm saying if you did believe that, if you thought I look put together up top, then you're probably going to believe I look put together on the bottom, right? Because it's just sort of like those things go together. And then, once somebody is already like enjoying somebody online and they already feel very positive about them, they're going to treat them well. And then guess what? That person is going to feel well received, and they're going to sort of live up to those expectations. And there's going to be this wonderful positive feedback communication loop between everyone. So it's going to confirm these positive things that the person already believes about the person. And none of this, by the way, is deception. It's just that, again, in these reduced cues computer environments, there's just a lot that we don't know, and we tend to fill that in with positive things, and we tend to control the situation to reflect on us very positively, okay? Oops, sorry. So all that is to say that you can it's not just personal communication, it's hyper personal, because all of those things make people seem better than they actually are in a way, right? And that is how I think people can fall in love very quickly in online environments, often even more quickly than they would face to face, where there's other sort of like barriers, right? All that stuff kind of gets washed out. Okay, and just to conclude all this, so remember, none of these things are saying that like this is always how it is. These are all just different ways that you can look at how different types of different types of technology in general can affect relationship development. Sometimes face-to-face communication is better. Other times it's the exact same, but you just need a little bit more time to work on things in computer environments. Sometimes it's actually better, if you want to say, like, it's actually more conducive to intimate communication, to communicate online. So that's the summary. Okay, now we're going to shift gears. You can watch this documentary if you want. If we were having not a real class, but an in-person class, I would show it to you. Now we're going to talk about social network sites, sort of, but really we're just going to talk about what social networks are mostly. So forget the internet for a second. Forget all that. Just think about just your social lives, your friends, your family. Your social network is considered all the individuals that you're connected to. I want to show you. Yeah, so all the people that you're connected to, and then who they're connected to. So if you're like this person, you're connected to this person and this person, and these are your friends. You don't know this person out here, but they're technically still part of your social network because you're connected through other people. Okay. And there's a whole study of social networks in general, because we know there's a lot of science to suggest that your social network affects your behavior. So even if you don't know these other people who you're connected to through other people, they have an influence on a lot of things that you do and a lot of things that you find normal. For instance, they know that obesity travels through social networks. Like if you have obese people in your social network, even if, again, they're not your best friends, it actually raises your chances of being obese. And there's various reasons for that. And if this is a different type of class, I would explain it to you. But all I want you to really understand is just that general principle about why social networks matter. And what's kind of cool is like, right, so our networks shape us, like I just mentioned, they have influence. Our friends affect us. But the big takeaway is even your friends' friends are kind of having an influence on you that you may not really be aware of. But the network doesn't stay the same. The network has this life of its own. And this is if you want to watch an interview with the person who does all this research. So like, let's just say your friend out here like dies. Or let's say like the friend here like moves or something and loses contact with all these people. Like over time, this network structure can sort of like change. Like it looks like an organism almost. It's really interesting. So you've yeah. And another thing I wanted to point out about these things is like, sometimes it looks like, oh, wouldn't you want to be like the people like in the middle who are like really well connected? But think about this. If, COVID was happening and you were trying to avoid like contagion, like maybe you would want to be like one of these outliers on the outside that's not so heavily embedded in a social network, where you have a lot of contacts that you're coming into contact with. I don't know. So it's just, don't just necessarily think that it's always better to be like a node in a cluster. Okay, so I already did that. We would watch this TED Talk, but we're not. Here are the things I want you to know for your quiz. So what we know about social networks and influence is basically there's like 6 degrees of separation. For like this was gosh, it's 1950s or 60s. I can't remember the exact year, but Stanley Milgram, he's the guy who did like the experiments that like had people pretend shock people. He did a letter study where he tried to figure out like, okay, what's the fewest amount of if I just said like, hey, I need you to get this letter to somebody in some random person in Japan, but you have to be able to go through your network. So you like give it to a friend and then you ask your friend like, hey, find a person who can get it to Japan. How many connections going down like, these nodes would it take you to go? And the answer was basically 6. So it means that we're all kind of connected like 6 steps away in our social network. Okay. But that doesn't mean that 6 people away from us are friends, friend, has influence on us. As far as influence, like the stuff about like contagion, like obesity contagion, there's even some emotional contagion research about this, that like depression can kind of like go through social networks. It's only 3 degrees of influence. So you can be affected by your friend, your friend's friend, and your friend's friend. And then after that, the amount of influence is kind of like minimized. So, even if we can like sort of use our social network within 6 steps, the influence is only through 3. Okay. Whatever. Do you even know who Kevin Bacon is? This is just another funny way of thinking about social networks, but we're all connected to Kevin Bacon. So social network sites are, I mean, they don't change the game because our social networks still work the same way. But one of the things I like about your book is like, right, it starts off talking like, here's the social networks. They're always here. How do social network sites change things? So what is a social network site? According to one of these famous definitions, it's a lot of jargon, but it's basically just a place where you can put a profile and other people can see who you're connected with, and then people can view those connections and traverse them, right? So this is how, like, you can figure out if you're looking for a job that you're like, oh my God, my friend actually knows somebody who is working at the company that I'm applying for, right? That's like new. We've always had those social networks, but we haven't really been able to see them, to visualize them. So one of the big things that social network sites introduced was just sort of like scope. We can now carry along more social connections with us. It doesn't extend our offline social network, but we now, in addition to our offline social network, have these massive online social networks in addition. They do not, interestingly enough, the influence does not work quite the same way. The influence on the best predictor of whether somebody in your social network is going to have some sort of like social influence on you is whether or not you've ever been tagged in a photo before, because I think it speaks to how close you are, but whatever. But anyway, now, you're carrying everybody around from, like, camp when you were 8 years old, like, for the rest of your life. So your social network online gets huge. But really, and this is what I want to highlight, is just what's really changed is that public display, the public displays of connections. Now that you can see your social connections, it's going to have implications for what you're influenced by, but other people can also see those social connections, right? It has influence in our interpersonal lives. I mean, as some of you might know, with, like, for instance, jealousy issues, romantic jealousy is impacted by things like this, but it also has a lot of, like, positive effects, as my example before, like, talked about, which, and actually I'll just yeah, I'll just close on that. Oh, nope, leave me alone. Um, a lot of people will say social networking sites, and people in my field always just say social network sites, because networking implies that we're always using, social network sites to get something, to, like, go to use our social network so that we can get some sort of favor or advantage or something like that. And that, like LinkedIn, that's the whole point of it, right? But a lot of social network sites really aren't about getting anything. It's just about viewing. It's just about observing those public displays of connections and what people are doing in it without actually networking. So just a little thing. Okay, and that's it. So we've gotten through the whole PowerPoint slides for relationships in the digital age. Woo! Okay, bye.